Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. You're probably all surprised to see this page here, Daraja Press. My friend Tariq Mahmoud keeps telling me that I should tell you a little bit more that I am associated. I'm the publisher of Daraja Press. So there's a website and they're the books that we want to go with. So feel free to visit that site anytime. All the broadcasts are on that website as well. It's me, Feroz Manji. Welcome to the show. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Today, we're going to be talking about organizing in the time of COVID-19, the eco-feminist perspective, coming especially from Kenya. Our guest today is Ruth Nyambura, who describes herself as a feminist, a political ecologist and activist, working on the intersection of gender, economy, and ecological justice. She's the founding member and the convener of the African Ecofeminists Collective, and also works with several regional agrarian and climate justice movement to track and challenge the privatization of the agrarian commons. She describes her work and activism that uses a feminist political ecology lens to critically engage with the continent and global food system, challenging neoliberal models of agrarian transformation and amplifying the revolutionary work of smallholder farmers of Africa, the majority of whom are, of course, women, as well as rural agrarian movements offering concrete anti-capitalist alternatives to the ecological, economic, and democratic crisis facing their continent. Today, Ruth will be reflecting on the eco-feminist analysis of the challenges women are experiencing on the lessons to be drawn from this period. I'd like to welcome you, Ruth, to this show. Thank you for sparing time to join us. Just for the interest of our people watching the show, Ruth's laptop and iPad stopped working, especially when she was about to come on the show. So she's using her phone, but it looks like it's working reasonably well. Ruth, thanks for coming on the show. I mean, data that's coming across from all parts of the world, but especially from the continent, is that not only are women the major productive force of the agricultural sector, but they are perhaps bearing the greatest brunt of the impact of the pandemic. Certainly figures around the growth in domestic violence are causes for real concern. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, thank you so much, Feroz, for having me on the show. Well, one of the things that's important to keep in mind around COVID-19 coronavirus is the fact that it is a crisis in itself, and it is bringing in new dimensions of multiple and intersecting forms of crisis, of course, gendered patriarchal crisis being one of them, but it also surfaces existing inequalities, structural inequalities around gender, around care. So you're right. In especially the last week, there's been a lot of reports from Kenya. There was a newspaper headline just a week ago detailing the fact that there's a rise of intimate partner violence, gendered violence against children across the country, but also across the world. I know that the World Health Organization actually addressed the fact that this is something to keep in mind. But I think it's important to say that, as I said in the beginning, that COVID-19 basically surfaces existing inequalities, existing forms of violence that feminists, women's rights groups, organizations across the world have been pushing for, and speaking about for very many years. Patriarchy doesn't stand still in the midst of a global pandemic. At the same time, we are living in an era where, for example, the complete collapse of public health systems, of course, historically linked to, in many parts of the global south, in Kenya and the rest of the continent, linked to structural adjustment programs. So basically, we're living through the afterlife of privatization of not just health systems, but systems of care. So systems of care that would be, supportive of women, of, trans people, trans Africans, queer Africans, because also it's not just violence against heterosexual women. I think it's important to also, to speak in terms of like the diversity of women. So it's not just violence against heterosexual women. So this intersecting forms of violence and the structures must be kept in mind, because there's a tendency to sort of have this reductionist thing around the fact that it's because of COVID-19 that we're now seeing an increase in violence against women. No, many women, many feminists have theorized, have spoken about that home is not necessarily a safe space for very many of us. It hasn't been a safe space for very many reasons. For many women, we still live in a world where men are, are more economically, are better off economically than women. Many women stay in abusive relationships because, they're incapable of, they have children, they have to think about multiple roles as mothers, with their children, and unable to move from spaces, from abusive situations. And also a state that is incapable of thinking through, thinking through patriarchal violence, but also a very masculine state, because it's not just, we are reading reports from countries like Rwanda, where it's not just husbands or boyfriends or lovers beating up women, it's the state. We have to remember that the state, has a monopoly of monopoly of violence. So we have soldiers raping women on the streets, and especially with the curfews and the lockdowns that we're experiencing. So the kinds of violence that we're experiencing, COVID-19 surfaces them, but it's important to keep in mind the kind of structure that COVID-19 basically finds this particular forms of violence.
Can you just give us some sort of idea of the scale of the spread of COVID-19 in Kenya? Because I'd quite like to get an understanding from you of how you see the state as dealing with this.
Okay, so this is that's a really interesting question, because I think just an hour ago, the Minister for Health was live on TV saying that I think the cases are up to 190, if I remember very well. We're just about to get to the 200 mark. So in Eastern Africa, Kenya is leading with in terms of the cases, but of course we actually don't know the extent of the cases because we're not in a situation where we have mass testing. So it's really impossible to say that this is a complete figure. But according to the government of Kenya, this is where we're at. Another thing that's really important to talk about is the fact that overwhelmingly the cases that we are seeing, people are talking about the class nature of COVID-19. We know for a fact that a lot of the cases have been by, middle class, upper middle class, or wealthy Kenyans, it hasn't been, and people are saying that we haven't seen in terms of like the cases amongst poor and working class. But interestingly, the solutions being proposed by the state in the last 2-3 weeks impact poor and working class Kenyans in horrible ways, so it's something to keep in mind. A lot of people are saying that COVID-19
can you explain that? Can you explain when you say it's a horrible ways? Well, what do you mean?
Okay. All right. So, okay, so I'll just continue, but I'll explain it in the sense that a lot of people are saying that COVID-19 is a great equalizer, but I think that's a very problematic reading of, what's actually happening on the ground, So we have a situation where last week on Monday, we started, no, almost 2 weeks ago, we started a curfew. So we have a curfew from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m. In the morning. We saw on the very first day of the curfew, police officers in the coast of the country literally beating up poor and working class Kenyans, moving from the north coast of Kenya to the south coast. A lot of these people provide labor, very cheap labor, to the north coast of Kenya. The south coast is also, I mean, the whole of coast region in Kenya is historically marginalized, but more so the south coast of Kenya. So, I mean, you're seeing that, the response of the state is absolute violence. We've seen images, videos of people, there's this man who was beaten up, I think, in Kakamega, but we have the police breaking into shops, working class neighborhoods, breaking into shops and stealing, and also on Monday, this past Monday, the president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, announced that Nairobi and parts of the coast of Kenya are going to go into a sort of like a containment. It's a form of lockdown where you can't people in Nairobi can't leave Nairobi, and people who are outside of Nairobi can't enter Nairobi. And the next day we saw desperate Kenyans, poor and working class who work in Nairobi, who rely on Nairobi in terms of making an income, having to use, routes literally unable to pass because there are roadblocks all over. So you see the fact that it's almost as if, the solutions being proposed by the state, are basically support the aspirations and the lives of the middle class and the rich in this country. But for the poor and the working class, there's almost no state support. Even the economic stimulus package that the president of Kenya announced about a week ago, has very little to say about, if at all, about the lives and the economic conditions of the poor and the working class in this country. Majority of people in this country work in the informal sectors, in various ways. We've already seen that during this pandemic, city council, officers basically destroying informal food markets. We're also seeing that, very interestingly, how we're hearing the Minister of Health, and the president and everyone saying that if you want food, just order, have it delivered by the supermarkets, get your groceries from the supermarket. But how many people actually get their foods from the supermarket? We rely on informal food traders. Majority of them are women. So it's clearly sort of like a supermarketization of the food system. It's a continuation of buy masks for yourselves, buy sanitizers for yourself. To date, it's been announced that if you're found in Nairobi, if you're found without walking in the streets without a mask, you're going to be fined 6,000 shillings, which is around $60, which is very interesting because right now people are unable to pay rents. A state that is not supporting the people economically, financially, providing systems for already existing community organizing platforms to prosper, basically resorting to criminalization of people. So clearly, for the middle class and the rich, who are able to have internet access in their houses. So internet access, they're able to get running water. It's sort of almost like, well, we're stuck in our houses with Netflix. We're stuck in our houses with Netflix. We can order in food, but amongst the poor, and we saw yesterday in Pipeline Estate, which is one of the most densely populated areas in Nairobi, and I think the whole country, where people are revolting. They're saying we cannot afford to pay rent, and you're seeing landlords, disconnecting water and electricity. So it's almost like we are not in this thing together. COVID-19 is not a great equalizer. Yeah.
I think that's a really important point, because it's quite clear in every part of the world, whether you're talking about the African continent, South Africa, it's become very clear. In the US, it's quite clear that African Americans and Latino people are amongst the worst affected. So I think it's a really important point that this is not an equalizer, but if there's a positive side, it at least helps us understand the nature of our societies, the way in which capitalism divides us into those who are privileged and those who are in the so-called sacrifice zones. One of the things that you've been well known for is being an organizer on so many different fields. Help me understand, what kind of organizing opportunities are there? What's the potential for organizing given what the situation that we face today?
Okay, so I will. This is one of the things that I've been really deliberating on since the whole COVID pandemic began, but also in the last 3 weeks in which we had, from the first time we had our case. So I'll start by talking about the situation that we find ourselves in this country, or in Nairobi, where I am based. The honest reality is that this country is a difficult place to organize, and Nairobi is more so a very difficult place to organize for various reasons, but chief of which, two reasons, is because one, there's a lot of NGOization of movements over the years that we have seen. Almost all responses emerge out of NGOs, which of course needs a much longer critique and must be nuanced, obviously, because NGOs have also served very positive functions. But it's incredibly difficult to organize in a space where you have very liberal politics. A lot of the organizing, if we're even to call it that, is basically sponsored by non-governmental organizations that are, at the end of the day, you need to account for ABCD and has to be in line with what donor requirements are. But importantly, we find ourselves in a situation where the state, you have to look at the history of this country, especially in the since the last 10 years or 12 years, there's increased criminalization in this country. We've had highly charged elections, especially the last election, and we clearly see how the state has been very willing, to not just criminalize, but to actually kill the poor, and especially poor young men. And we've seen from the brilliant work being done by the social justice centers across the country, but more so the Mathare Social Justice Center. So we have to put that in mind in terms of organizing. But I think one of the things that's really important, even as we see what the difficulties are, or the difficulties of being around organizing in this country and in this city, is the fact that more and more, with the Mathare Social Justice Center, we are seeing I've been part of the food movement. I'm part of the food movement in this country, and especially after the 2007-2008 food crisis, and we've seen very many poor and working class movements, such as Bunge la Wamama, which is grassroots women's parliament, and the Bunge la Mwananchi, grassroots people's parliament, as well as various food and agrarian movements in the country coming together and actually, doing a lot of political education, doing a lot of political analysis, and connecting not just the crisis as we see it, but actually looking at the structures, what forms the space that we are in. So I see that there's an important space in terms of, engaging with the queer movement in this country, which has grown exponentially. And we've seen from the activism and the work that's been happening, the feminist movement also in this country, the food and agrarian movements in this country, but also importantly, the amazing work that is being done by the Social Justice Center in terms of not just looking at police violence or the state violence at a very surface level, but actually connecting it to, its economic roots and origins. So I see those as fantastic spaces to, in terms of like intervening and like spaces to organize. However, I will say one thing. One of the things that we need to guard about when we organize is the fact that, like now, the last 3 weeks, there have been so many groups, wonderful groups, faith-based organizations, feminist groups, individuals coming together, packs in order to distribute to the poor and the working class. And that's fantastic. But this has happened before. In fact, I say that Kenya is notorious for individualizing solutions. and this is a state tactic. And we've looked at, a few years ago, we had a really bad drought and famine, and we had Kenyans for Kenya, where many Kenyans, basically funded this charity kitty to buy food, but it doesn't address why people go hungry. It doesn't address the failures of the public health system. And I know, in the face of difficulties, that's what we can do. We need to make sure that people don't sleep hungry. But I think we need to guard against this whole cycle of, when there's a crisis, we come together and basically apply band-aids. Yes, they're band-aid solutions, and they, as I said, they ensure that people don't sleep hungry. But I think it's important that we take to heart really radical organizing. And that's something that is missing. And that's something that, missing in the sense that there are very many groups doing very many things, but it's important that these groups come together and actually work on some form of, the dangers of silo politics, the dangers of silo organizing, So the failures of the health system are connected to the failures of the food system, and failures, the failures and the kinds of violence that we see that women, queer, trans people experience in this country. They're all connected. And it's important that we elevate our forms of organizing to actually make this analysis. And of course, it means that we have to allow for serious political education, and some forms, mediated through NGOs. But I think that we are ready for really ripe anti-capitalist, even leftist organizing. We saw this in the 1980s and the early 90s. This is something, we have a history of that, and we need to recover these forms of organizing and analysis, and of course, build onto it. That's something that we need to urgently do.
So the prospects on the world scale in terms of major recession, and it's quite clear that the situation for countries like Kenya is pretty serious, and its impact will have on the price of food. Are you seeing this already in terms of access to food becoming even more problematic?
One of the, this COVID couldn't have come at a worse time, because, as you know, Eastern Africa is facing, we have a locust invasion, so it's actually, it's really dangerous in the sense that we are facing a health crisis in the country, but also a country that, of course, is not immune to the external shocks of the rest of the world. But we also have locust invasion across Eastern Africa, and of course in Kenya. So, one of the things in terms of food, we know that there's almost always enough food for people to eat, but many people sleep hungry because they're locked out of the markets. As simple as that, and without a state at this particular moment that is thinking through reducing the price of basic commodities. In fact, one of the worst things that's happening, the government of Kenya is preparing to table tax bill that is going to raise the costs of basic commodities. It's ridiculous. Not just ridiculous, it's disgusting when you really think about it. So I do envision that the longer this crisis continues, the prices of basic commodities is going to increase. And you know what, Firoz? Even if the prices of the basic commodities does not increase, the reality is majority of people are out of work. I was walking in Nairobi. I was in the CBD yesterday, and everyone I spoke to, it's a horrible situation. People have lost about 80-90% of their customer base in the last 3 weeks in itself. So even if the price of unga remains 100 shillings, if you don't have an income anymore, it doesn't matter whether it goes up or down. And without safety nets, it's a devastating crisis. And of course, you also have to add on to the fact that it's not just COVID, it's not just the locust, but also we are facing a climate crisis. We can see that the weather patterns in everything has changed in the last few years. So it's sort of like everything is I'm very worried. I'm going to say that. I'm very worried. And of course, in the absence of a strong grassroots collective organizing base and a government that is has shown itself completely incapable of centering the lives of those marginalized, centering the aspirations of the poor and the working class, centering the lives of women, of frontline workers, and not frontline workers in the romanticized way that people are saying across the world. I mean, doctors need protective gear. It's not just the doctors and nurses. It's not just this, let's clap for them, or let's send them flowers, as our president actually did. He sent flowers to nurses who don't have protective kits. So I mean, it's sort of like we're living in a multiple and parallel worlds. So without that, the crisis ahead is horrible. I That's what I think.
Yes, I mean, Kenya has a long reputation of organizing around the issue of food. I mean, the Unga Revolution that has
Yes.
been taking place on several occasions. I mean, and in Bolivia, for example, many of those communities who are unable to practice social distancing, 6 feet away from each other, are actually have taken to the streets. Do you see something like that
Yes.
happening in Kenya?
Absolutely. I've been reading reports of Bolivia, and for sure, I mean, as I said, the center has never held it together. It is only held because of the threat of the army or the paramilitary being sent to the streets, which, as I said, successive Kenyan governments have never been afraid to do. But I mean, as I saw yesterday, I saw this clip from, as I said, Pipeline Estate, one of the, I mean, it's really essentially a poor working class neighborhood and highly densely populated, where tenants said that we cannot pay. We simply cannot pay this rents. We are out of work. We work in industrial area. These are people who even walk to work. They can't even afford transport. People
So
walking to
are
work.
there
Yeah.
potential for rent strikes?
Yes. I I believe. Look, I believe that So this is a bit complicated in the sense that I believe there's a potential for rent strikes. In terms of it scaling up, is something that I'm still yet to see. But I believe there's a potential, at least in poor and working class neighborhoods. There's no money, and of course we are seeing landlords already, I mean, really disgustingly, we're seeing, clips of landlords breaking doors, removing the roofs of people who have been unable to pay rent for April. So I think, I mean, you'll get to a point, if you can't eat, you can't feed yourself. You're also Nairobi at this moment where people have been locked in. You can't even leave the city. You can't go say, I'm going back to my rural area, to my rural home where at least there's a farm I can farm. If we have that, then definitely we're going to see, rent strikes, or I mean, people taking to the streets. I mean, that's the only logical thing to happen, because I mean, people are asking everywhere, not just in Kenya, across Africa, in South Africa, I mean, as you said, in Bolivia, in everywhere. I mean, in Italy, the south of Italy, I was watching this last week, I mean, why should I be afraid of Corona? And hunger is at my doorstep. So at
Yes.
this moment, people have a lot more to fear about hunger and poverty and starvation than they have to fear around a disease.
I mean,
So it's a horrible space to be in, for sure.
yeah. I mean, one of the things I think that people are not aware of is that the people who live as shack dwellers, even though they just have a few wooden structures with no water, no sanitation, nothing like that, are still paying rent,
Yes.
and uh, and so there is a motivation for, as we've seen in South Africa, in
Hmm.
eThekwini, where they're just demolishing, they're using the
Yes.
COVID situation
Hmm.
to demolish these shack dweller occupations. And it's not something new to us in Kenya either, I
Mm,
believe. That has been
absolutely.
seen
Yeah.
often. One of the characteristics of the responses of many of the African governments, I mean, especially in Kenya, has been the coercive uh, response, the
Hmm.
reaction of putting of militarizing, of securitizing
Mm,
the streets. and using violence against people who are apparently breaking the curfew or whatever. But what's happening in the jails? What's happening in the prisons? I remember visiting a number of prisons in the past where the conditions of how people are shacked up together, and especially amongst women prisoners, it's an outrageous situation at the best of times. What is happening in relation to that today in Kenya, and what's the impact of this this pandemic?
Okay, so immediately when we had our first coronavirus case, our first patient. One of the things that the judiciary did was the fact that it said that petty offenders should be released, and that has happened. We've had quite a number of I'm not quite sure the numbers yet, but should be in their thousands. Not, I mean, I think 5,000 if I remember well. Quite a number of prisoners have been released, but in terms of like petty offenses, there's also a 30-day moratorium on jail visits, which, of course, as you said, jail conditions, prison conditions in this country, as in most countries in the world, are absolutely horrible. So, of course, that is an issue. But also, we've seen the judiciary moving to, basically delivering. We've seen quite a number of rulings being delivered online. I think I remember the Chief Justice of Kenya a week ago in a press conference saying that by the end of this month, there's going to be, I think, a thousand judgments delivered online. But that's great. But that's not enough. I think an abolitionist politics is also necessary. It's absolutely important to think through. And one of the ways to think through an abolitionist politics is, a lot of the people who find themselves in Kenyan jails are, very colonial, British laws around loitering, basically the very fact that, especially for young men, the very fact that they exist, they're criminals, their presence is criminalized. The fact that they exist means that they're criminals. So that is a response that we have seen, but it doesn't go deep enough, and that worries. I mean, already as it is, prisoners who are sick, it's not like they get fantastic, conditions in terms of like a healthcare system for them in normal circumstances. So I cannot imagine if COVID-19 starts to sweep through the jails and prisons of this country, it's going to be horrible. But there hasn't been. I mean, these are people who are already discarded by society, already considered, disposable, also considered disposable by the state. So really, in terms of like thinking through the lowest of the lowest, they're already there, and everyone thinks that this form of punitive punishment is what they deserve. So even if they died, I really wonder whether the state would be like, this is what we need to focus on.
So finally, as an ecofeminist, what are the priorities? What are you saying to the feminist movement in Kenya? What are the priorities? What needs to be organized first? What needs to be done in this situation?
The first thing I think that is absolutely important, we must defend the work that farmers are doing, smallholder farmers, majority of whom are women, but we also must defend the urban-rural links in terms of the food supply system. We call them mamambogas in Kenya. The women who, they have small kiosks, or we call them vibandas. Where we get most of our food from, fresh vegetables, fruits. And I think it's important that, and I've seen a few models. I think I've seen it in Kerala, and other few places across the world where the prioritizing of the distribution models and channels already existing, and of course we can modify them for the times. I think it's important to basically defend them, because we risk coming out of this crisis where there's more corporate entrenchment within the food and agricultural system. we know very well that the poor and working class, I mean, really, now African cities, I mean, I think up to 70-80% in most African cities depend on informal food supply chains in order to be able to get at least fresh food, And if we say that people are going to get we defend the fact that people are going to get groceries from supermarkets. What happens to it's not just about erasing the work of informal food traders, but also what signals does it send in terms of the kinds of food supply systems that we want to see. So I think that is absolutely important. We must also defend and continue to ask for the right to water. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, I live in a fairly middle class area, and we still don't have running water. We have running water maybe twice over the weekend. And still, even with this pandemic, the government of Kenya has not ensured that there's running water across this country. It's really it's unbelievable. And we know that for women on this continent, the care work related to fetching water and fetching clean water falls on them. The triple burden of being mothers, being carers, so being, carers, especially at this particular moment where if someone gets sick with the coronavirus, it most definitely the care work will fall on women. And without sanitation, without food, fresh, affordable food, I think we'll find ourselves in a really horrible place. So I think that must be defended. But at the end of the day, also, Firoz, I really must insist. I think it's important also to ensure that we continue to wage the ideological battle. I think that is absolutely important for feminists. We need to guard against, as eco-feminists, as feminists in Africa, we need to guard against very liberal forms of solutions, mostly individualized, that purport to get us out of this crisis and systems that we find ourselves in. I think we need to be very serious about what is the kind of world that we want to see in. We need to have these conversations of a new world. We need to have those conversations, Firoz. As I said, we can't go back to normal because normal was the problem, of course, for across the world. And a pro-capitalist, pro-corporation, pro-securitization normal is something that we as feminists, as women, cannot afford to go back to. So even the ideological battle, even as we struggle to figure out how do we get the food on people's tables, how do we make sure that people are not evicted from their homes, the ideological battle must be fought. It really must be fought. It's unfair that people die of hunger. It's unfair that, the kind of patriarchal violence that we see. And it's unfair that we are always at the mercies of security forces and a state that doesn't care about us. So that also I think it's important for us as African feminists to charter a way forward ideologically.
Well, you're absolutely right there. We need to have some ideological clarity, some analytical clarity. But at the same time, as my old friend, the late Tajuddin Abdulrahim used to say, we need to organize, not merely agonize.
Yes.
Ruth, thank you so much for sparing time to be with us on this show. It's really, really fascinating to get your insight into what the situation is and the perspectives, which are very rarely expressed as clearly and openly as you do around what it means to be a feminist in a situation that we face in Kenya and across the continent. So I want to thank you very much for joining us on this show. If you want to say any last words, floor is open.
I thank you so much, Firoz. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And yes, I will also be the one of the people who will say that for sure, Follow Daraja Press, you have been at the forefront of producing a lot of very radical work that many of us have been part of producing. But importantly, I want to end with something that last week we had the African Ecofeminists Collective organized a webinar, and I want to end with something that a quote that from the Sandinistas that I take to heart. Solidarity, is the expression of the tenderness of the people. And I really hope that in these times that we express our tenderness through the kinds of solidarity that we offer one another. Yes, thank you so much, Rose.
Well, that reminds me of another recent expression somebody said at a conference. Solidarity is what love looks like on the streets.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know that quote. Thank you. It's amazing. It's beautiful.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us, and I
Thank you
look
so
forward
much,
to
Rose.
further opportunities to interact. Please do keep us in touch with when you're organizing your next webinar. I think it was a really important initiative that you've taken, and feel free to reach out to the people. We're now reaching nearly 12,000 people who are watching the show. So do feel free to post to the Organizing in the Time of COVID-19 page. Ruth, thank you very much indeed. And I look forward to further interactions with you.
Thank you so much, and take care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.